Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast for investors interested in Indigenous investment in Canada. Born from the Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit, the show focuses on the intersection of Indigenous economic strategies and investment opportunities. I'm Mark McNacken, and my co-host Robert Brandt and I are joined today by Kody Penner, Vice President of Corporate Development for Nations Royalty. He was recently chosen as one of the 5 2024-2025 Kakahashi Project Young Leaders, demonstrating his dedication to advancing Indigenous interests in the resource sector. Join us as we explore how these critical conversations are reshaping economic development across Canada.
Kody Penner, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
In the new year. It's great to have you with us. Nations Royalty getting a lot of publicity these days, including at a conference, a mining conference, global mining conference in London before Christmas. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we're really lucky to have you with us to talk about yours and Nations Royalties story.
Awesome. Yeah, once again, thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you here. And I think you also just came back from Japan. Was that correct?
Yeah, I was just in Japan for a week. It was a great experience. I got invited. It's called the Kakahashi Project, and that means bridge in Japanese. And essentially, it's the Asia Pacific Foundation it gets different nominations for young business leaders, is what they kind of labeled it as, to go to Japan and experience the culture. We met with the Canadian Business Council over there, talked about Indo-Pacific strategy, Japanese Business Council, the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Hokkaido government, and the Ainu Indigenous group, which I learned, I didn't spend much time looking at Japanese history, but I learned there are Indigenous people in Japan. So we actually got to go to their museum and experience some of their culture. And we actually ate a chunk of dried salmon with them. And we all sat in like a traditional house. So, fantastic trip. Always wanted to go to Japan, and to be able to go over in that sort of fashion was an amazing experience.
Great country.
Yeah.
Sounds like a really unique experience. Kody, why don't we start by talking a bit about you and your background? Where did you grow up? I know you're Tahltan Nation, proud member, but tell us a bit more about your upbringing.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I grew up actually outside of the nation. So born in Nelson, British Columbia, southern mid kind of tip of British Columbia, Western Canada. Moved to Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, and then over to Strathmore, Alberta by Calgary, and then grew up in Salmon Arm, BC. So kind of moved all around Western Canada as a young person, and then ended up living in Vancouver. Worked a slew of different jobs, and then ended up working underground in a gold mine in Northwest British Columbia called Bruce Jack Gold Mine, now owned by Newmont. So dad's a miner, brother's a mining engineer, so it's kind of been in my blood since I was young. So I ended up following in the footsteps and running heavy machinery, jack legs, big haul trucks, different equipment underground, and then connected back with the Tahltan Nation and actually worked for the Tahltan Central Government as the employment director, which was a really good experience. I got to sit in elder council meetings and board meetings, really understand our strategy and how we want to grow as a nation. Right. And then decided to go back to school. So I studied commerce at the University of British Columbia at Sauder, specialized in finance, and then worked in investor relations with Skeena Resources, mine up in Northwest BC, the past producing SK Creek mine, and then worked for Gentis Capital in investment research, so equity research in the mining space. It's a small boutique. Michael Gray is one of the partners, fantastic geologist. So got a kind of mentor under him. And then worked at Tech Resources in a strategy finance role in the copper growth team at Tech. So our job was to allocate capital across 9 different development assets, and kind of bring in all the different factors of that, whether it's risk and jurisdiction and all these different pieces to see where we want to put our money to grow our copper output in the future, right? So very good experience. And then I landed at Nations Royalty. And also, I recently resigned, but for the past 3.5 years, I was the vice chair of the Tahltan Nation Development Corporation. So I definitely know a little bit about Indigenous business, mining, capital markets, Indigenous governance, and you bring that all together, and it lends quite well to helping grow a Indigenous-owned royalty company.
Absolutely unique experience to have real, literally under the ground in the ground experience working with those rocks.
Something that was cool about that I really enjoyed is I was actually working alongside a lot of my Telten family. So I got to go to community and I got to understand, like, why do people do these jobs? Why do you actually go in I mean, at the end of the day, it's a hole in the ground, right? Like, it's got lighting, it's all safe and like all these things, but it's a hole in the ground. It's a tough job. You're away from your family for 3 weeks at a time. And I got to really understand why people do it. Like, what are the values, right? It's family. You want your kids to get educated. You want all these things to better yourselves and your community. And mining projects really help provide that. So I'm deeply passionate about the industry and the value that it can drive at a community level and at a government, BC, Canada level, whether it's tax revenue or the supply chain inclusion, all these different pieces. But I'm very passionate about the industry. And yeah, like I said, one thing about working in the mine is understanding what the mine means to the people, right? What it means to their livelihood and their kids and for future generations.
That is great experience. And I think you're right. And when you talk through your profile, I mean, I don't think there's that many people who've had that, working in the mine experience, even though, mining's a huge industry.
Yeah.
I think that gives you a unique perspective. And as you said, how does that relate to the Indigenous peoples, and what are the values and why would you do something like that? So I think that's great background. And now you're at Nations Royalty.
I'm in Nations Royalty. Yeah. So I'm Vice President of Corporate Development at Nations Royalty. I've been here since June. So June 10th was the start date. And it's been an amazing experience. It kind of came out of left field a little bit for me. Like, I was working in tech. I had a great role. I wasn't planning on leaving, to be honest. It's a great company to work for. It's funny. The building that you see in the background is actually Tech's main office. So I went across the street to this role. But when I was working at the Telten central government, I was starting to understand how we created different impact benefit agreements and how we got different equity deals and projects. And in my mind, I was just like, there's got to be a way to leverage these financial instruments and these agreements that we're creating to create extra value. Like, I watched the industry do it in other ways, right? Like, what is a bank? A bank is essentially just a big lever, right? They lever a small amount of deposits for financial gain. And I was looking at all of the agreements we were creating as a Telten Nation. I was like, there's got to be a way to lever this. And this company, Nations Royalty, was the first one that I saw where you could create extra value with the things that we already own. The premise of our business, and I'm sure we'll dive into it, is to collect different royalty streams from different Indigenous groups across Canada and internationally into a single vehicle, publicly traded vehicle, to create extra value above and beyond what they're worth by themselves. So when I saw the news release go out in February, I believe, I thought, holy cow, this is the answer to the question that I had when I was working at the Telten central government. Basically, from there, I connected with Rob, our interim CEO, and Brian Waymark, one of the co-founders as well, and started the conversation. And a few months later, ended up at Nations Royalty.
Beautiful. Tell us a bit about the genesis of the Nations Royalty, the business. It's a relatively new business. It's a new concept. Yeah.
Well, it's funny. It's a new concept, but it's actually an old business model, right? The mining royalty business model has been around for decades. So you have the Wheaton Precious Metals and the Franco-Nevada and the Royal Gold. Those are the three big royalty companies, and they've been around for 30 plus years. I think Franco-Nevada initially went public in the 80s, late 80s, with the Gold Strike deposit in Nevada. And since then, they have been some of the top performing mining and metals companies in the market, right? People love the business model, right? You get access to the underlying commodity by directly investing in a royalty, right? Which is essentially just a part of production. There's different structures, but the top royalty companies have top line royalties, right? Net smelter returns, gross royalty revenues, things of those natures. So an investor loves that. They get access to the commodity without the downside erosion of operating a mine, right? So if you want to get access to gold, say you believe gold is going to go up, how do you invest? You can either buy bullion, right? You can go buy a chunk of gold if you'd like. Go buy an ETF. If you want leverage on it, then you go into the equities, right? You can either go exploration, which generally gives you a little bit more of a lift, or you go into a senior producer, a little bit less of a lift. Royalty companies are the exact same. If you invest in a precious metal royalty company, you get access to that commodity, but once again, you don't have the underlying erosion of operating. So we use that exact same business model that investors love and that they pay a premium for, upwards of 2 times PNAV, price over net asset value, which is a very high valuation. We're in the exact same business model, but with a new twist. We work in the Indigenous royalty space. So the Indigenous people of Canada and internationally have a tremendous amount of value in their royalty agreements, right? So between, like, say, if you're a miner that wants to bring an asset into production in the past 30 years in Canada, you most likely have an impact benefit agreement signed with your local Indigenous group. Within that impact benefit agreement, there's many things. There's education, infrastructure spend, culture revitalization, what have you. And then there'll be financial payments, which is essentially a royalty, right? And just to show you the size, in Canada alone, in 2023, there was $350 million worth of these payments paid to Indigenous groups just in the metals and mining sector. If you include oil and gas, that number actually climbs to over $700 million. That's cash payments paid to Indigenous groups just in 2023. Those payments are all going to Indigenous groups by themselves. They're in isolation. What we look to do is collect them into a singular umbrella, Nations Royalty, in exchange for equity or potentially cash in our company. So that'll be the exchange with the Indigenous group. We'll get the rights to all or a portion of those future payments, and we'll issue new shares, new equity, and we'll give that to them. It's a value exchange, right? If they want a cash portion, we could do cash, but we would really like them to be partners with us and come along the journey. And what happens is when you collect more of these royalties into a single portfolio, just like the Francos and Wheaton and the Royal Golds, just like they have done, you build a diversified portfolio of top tier royalties, and you can extrapolate and get those premium valuations that go above and beyond the net asset value that any single royalty is worth. So same business model, but with a new twist. We're first movers in the space. There's never been anybody that's done this before, right? These agreements have existed for a long time, but no one's actually created an Indigenous royalty company. This is the first one, right? So we're first movers in this space. And when I talk about that $700 million market, some of these royalty companies trade at 24, 25 times cash flow. So you can only imagine the size of the company that we can create if we're able to capture, capture 300 million of that 700 million, right? You can have a serious royalty company in a matter of years if we can achieve our growth strategy.
And will you be precious metals only royalties or?
Yeah, precious metals focused. So in Canada, there's a significant amount of top tier gold mines, and Canada's a safe jurisdiction, right? We don't have a ton of geopolitical risk, all these different things. And if it's already operating, then it already has if you'd like to label this, a social license to it. And if we're working with the local Indigenous group, that's a pretty, de-risked investment, right? So precious metals, safe jurisdictions, investors love that, right? Once again, there's much less geopolitical risk. Canada has some amazing geology. We have some top tier gold mines in the world, I would say. Detour Gold Mine, Canadian Malartic, Meliadine, even those are kind of running out. Blackwater is about to come online soon. We have Bruce Jack, which we actually have a royalty on. And we would like to be precious metals focused, but we're also looking at base metals and energy as well. And to prove the model, we might end up doing a partnership on something that's out of precious metals, but long-term focus, we would like precious metals exposure that's above 50%, 75%, somewhere around there.
And you went public earlier this year. You did a small financing, and you must have weighed up the pros and cons of going public versus raising money in other ways. Why go public?
Yeah, it's always an interesting one. I mean, going public is always a benefit because it's easier to do your marketing and the concept is proven as well, right? So when the inception of this was kind of brought forward by Rob McLeod, our interim CEO, and Nisga'a leadership, it's an idea until you kind of go public or kind of move it forward in that matter. Because when you go public, you allow investors to obviously purchase shares on the market, and that pushes the price up. So you receive those premium valuations, right? Basically, those, an increased PNAV or price over net asset value is essentially perception, right? The market perceives that you're going to be, increasing cash flow or getting more precious metal focus or whatever it may be. So you get that higher valuation. So that's one of the top reasons that we wanted to go public. And it's also easier to raise capital in that form. It's a tough market right now, especially for juniors and royalty companies and things like that. If you're not a top producer that's stable and dividend producing, it's difficult to raise capital. So going public made that a little bit easier. We work in the Fiore group, which is headed off by Frank Giustra. For those of you that don't know him, he's a mining entrepreneur. He was the co-founder of Wheat Precious Metals, which is the largest royalty company in the world. They trade around 40 billion market cap Canadian. And he was the co-founder of Goldcorp, which was the largest gold mining company on the planet. So very successful mining entrepreneur. And he really helped, him and the Fiore group, which Gordon Keep and their team, really helped us go public and access capital when others weren't able to, which is a huge benefit. So going public has some downsides. Obviously, it's a little bit more, a little more regulatory filings and pieces like that. It costs a little bit more, but the access to capital, the increased valuations, and also the proof of concept, right? When we're talking with other Indigenous groups, we can now say that we are a public company. We're publicly traded. You can go buy our shares if you like. And that really changes the conversation as well versus being like, oh, this is an idea, right? We have these 5 royalties that the Nisga'a own, and we want to put them into a public company and then get other ones. We already have done that. We've already gone public. We're trading on the market. We're trading on the Frankfurt, the OTCQB, sorry, in the States, and on TSXV in Canada. So we're already trading, and that alleviates a lot of pressure of having to do that in the future.
And I guess if you're trying to convince other Indigenous nations, communities to sell you their royalties, then if you're trading more liquid, publicly traded stock, then that's a little bit easier conversation to have.
Yeah, it's definitely an easier conversation. We do have low volume right now. We have a very tight float, which is something that we're going to have to look at in the future. But yeah, 100%. It makes it a much more palatable partnership when you can actually see that it's trading and there is a path to being able to say you need to liquidate a little bit. You want to do a community development project, like help increase or build a road or a school or put money into education, what have you. You have an option to, sell some of your position and actually put that money towards that, right? Or lever it, depending how you trust or structure your trust, right? So if an Indigenous group ends up with a big chunk of nation's royalty equity in the future, they might be able to lever on that. And that's what gets me excited about this job, is being able to create wealth for Indigenous groups and build up a balance sheet with them so they can actually go do these projects that they want to do.
So I think there's a couple of interesting things, because you're an example of a proven business model. Now that the Indigenous peoples of Canada own their assets and there's less barriers for them leveraging them and managing and developing their own nations and territory, you're a good example of, here's a proven business model. Now we're going to apply this to the Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And like I said, it's going back to, in my personal experience, it's going back to that, my thoughts when I was working in the Teltan central government, I think in 2019, of like, okay, how do we lever what we already have? Right? Like, this is, to your point, a proven business model. People have done this before and received up to 2 times the PNAV valuation, which means they're, I'm just going to make an example up for the listeners. If you have $10 million sitting in a 1 times PNAV company, that's worth $10 million. If you have that exact same $10 million sitting in a 2 times PNAV company, it's worth $20 million to the market, right? So you're creating extra value that would never have been achieved if you didn't create the business and pool these royalties. It's an amazing business model. It almost sounds like magic, right? But I mean, you got to think about it. To my earlier comments, building out a nice diversified portfolio of top producing precious metals and other other mines creates a tremendous amount of value that investors love, and it's been proven for years. And to your point, we're just doing it with a new twist with Indigenous lens on it.
Yes. You mentioned Nisga'a have come in as the initial transferred some of their royalty streams. I assume it's not all of their royalties.
It's funny, they actually transferred in all 5 of their impact benefit agreement royalties. So in British Columbia, there's 2 kind of royalty streams, if you'd like to label them as royalties, that go to Indigenous groups. First is with the province. So they actually have a tax revenue sharing agreement where part of the taxes paid from the mine go to the local Indigenous group, the impacted community, which is amazing. And then on the second side, you have an impact benefit agreement that's signed directly between the Indigenous group and the mining company, the proponent. And that royalty structure can be different. It's whatever's negotiated between the groups. And Nisga'a actually vended in all 5 of their impact benefit agreement payments into Nations royalties. So we did a quick model on it when they were kind of going through the inception, and the net asset value of those 5 royalties, just the impact benefit agreement side, was 214 million US. So when they kind of saw that, Nisga's always been leaders in many senses, and when they saw that, they thought, "Holy cow, we have the inception of a royalty company," right? Because it's a significant amount of money. A lot of it is in the future in development stage, but once those start paying, those cash flows that we will start to see will lend very well to the company, and we'll be able to redeploy those into high return areas.
And I guess from Nisga's perspective, they're all in. How tied in are they with their? Could they sell their shares tomorrow if they wanted to?
Yeah, well, they have a 3-year escrow. So they have a 3-year holding period on their shares. They own 77% of the company, which is significant, right? Those are vested a little in different periods throughout the 3 years, but they're in this for the long haul. They said to us on multiple occasions, they've said publicly, they are in this to grow. They would rather own 10% of a $2 billion company than 77% of a $100 million company. And Charles Morvan, the Secretary Treasurer, has publicly said like they would like to never sell them. They would like to see this grow and bolster their balance sheet, pay dividends for a long, long time, and give them the ability to lever off of their equity in the future to use this as a nice principal base to grow off of. So they're in it for the long haul. They believe in the concept. They actually go and do nation meetings with us. They were just at Resourcing tomorrow in London, as you mentioned earlier, Rob, with us, and they're extremely supportive of the business. And once again, they're in it for the long haul. They want to see this turn into a multi-billion-dollar company, and they're all in.
And I guess from their perspective, it's a chance to diversify themselves once the company develops and is able to bring in more royalty streams. It'll help diversify their own cash flows.
Yeah, 100%. And that's kind of the premise of the whole business model, is building out a nice portfolio of these royalty streams, right? Like when you are able to create diversification through owning many different royalties, that takes the load off of the ones that you have in your territory. Nisga's lucky that they had 5 agreements that they had prior to vesting them into Nations royalty. Some groups only have 1 or 2, right? So if there would happen to be a disaster at the mine, their payments would go to 0. But if they owned equity in Nations royalty, as we build out this portfolio, it's better to own a little bit of many royalties than 100% of one. And that's the vision that Nisga'a had as well, right? I mean, the Golden Triangle, where Nisga'a is in Northwest British Columbia, is one of the hottest mineral exploration and mining zones, kind of globally. And even though it is a top zone, things do happen, right? Commodity prices can slump. Some key infrastructure might not get in place up here. There's different pieces that might not happen, but if they're able to share their royalties with other groups, and those other groups share their royalties with Nisga'a, you're able to lower risk for all groups and create those premium valuations that royalty companies have been receiving for years.
And what about, Kody, some of the pain points that other Indigenous nations are looking at? What are some of the areas that they think are challenging to come in and participate in the model? How do you address some of those points?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's many things to do. I mean, one of the things too is it's a new venture, is one of the main pieces, right? Like you're an Indigenous group, you've already come up with this agreement with the company, and you've used lawyers in this whole process, and you've achieved this agreement. You've got it. But now somebody comes in and there's this new model. They're like, hey, vend in that royalty for equity in the company, and it's a little bit scary, right? Like there's a little bit of risk to it outside of just sitting there and waiting to collect checks. You can receive a ton of extra value, once again, upwards of 2 times the value, which is tremendous. And there's a bunch of things that go through on the valuation piece, but it's a new venture. It poses a little bit of risk. So our biggest piece is education, right? It's going to different groups and explaining what the royalty model is, explaining how we can create extra value, how we can lower risk, right? And all these wonderful pieces that a royalty company can provide. So a big part of it is the capacity and the education and the training, right? And sometimes we go in and we chat with chief and councils and different folks, and they are very busy people with a million pressures on them, right? They have community concerns, they have education to think about, wildlife, environment, all these brand claims, all these things. So when I come in and I'm like, hey, do you want to invest in a royalty model, right? Now it's like, okay, well, what is a royalty model? So now we need to start kind of from that point forward. So some of the main points is, once again, understanding that. And then pending on the group is getting community to understand that as well, right? So, it's one thing to talk with advisors and financial people and chief and councils, but pending on how the group's structured, some want us to talk with community. So now we're once again trying to explain a mining royalty model to community. And some of them might be, maybe they're electricians or they work in HR, or they work in these different areas that isn't, mine finance. So a big part of it is the educational process. The risk piece, and there's always more from that end. Sometimes it's control as well. We do offer Indigenous groups, if they do end up with a large piece of equity in our company, we do say that you will have a board seat, right, depending on the structure, and you'll be able to help guide the company. But as the company grows and we become a $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion company, your equity will shrink naturally, right? So it's a control piece too, right? So some groups are saying, well, I actually own my royalty now 100%. I'm going to receive those payments if I vested into you. Now you control that investment. You control that money going forward. So now we need to just show them like, hey, we have people like myself and our chief investment officer, Derek Pattinen, our CEO, Rob McLeod, Frank Justra. We have all these people that are able to use those funds to deploy them into high return areas that'll give you a good return. Right. So it's a control thing. It's an educational thing. And we're working through those. We're a new company. Obviously, there's going to be bumps in the road, but we have been able to answer a lot of those questions, and it's been going very well. And we hope to have some new partnerships in the new year.
Excellent. And you're also on a number of different markets, as you mentioned earlier, for example, in Germany.
Yep.
What's the pitch to potential investors in Germany? And, of course, you've just started out and it's early days, but some people must be coming and asking questions because you're probably introducing not necessarily a new business model, but as we said, with the Indigenous peoples, and that's kind of new and different.
Yeah, no, it's new and different. And so what I like to tell investors in the European markets that might not understand the Indigenous landscape quite as much as, say, a Canadian investor or potentially an American investor, is this is the same business model. Once again, it's the same model as the Franco, the Wheaton, all these great companies, but with a new twist, right? So where do you want to put your money if you're investing in a royalty company, right? All these small companies have been having a very, very hard time growing. They either need to niche into, different markets, maybe they're pure lithium play, which it doesn't have a proven PNAV multiple, or they go into unsafe jurisdictions, or they have to go earlier in the development stage into exploration. I'm talking with Indigenous groups that have royalties on some of the top producing gold mines in Canada. Right. So if you like royalty companies and you want torque on the price and you want to put your money on a bet that has that can actually achieve a portfolio of top tier royalties in safe jurisdictions, we're a great bet. We're a great company to put that money into and watch us grow, because once again, there's no other small royalty company that's able to talk with large mining companies like Detour, Canadian Malartic, or Blackwater, all these ones that I mentioned. There's actually, even if you're a large royalty company, no one's going to even create a royalty on these mines. Like, the only companies that have a royalty on them are Wheaton and Franco, or the large ones, because they put in that construction capital at the outset. We're the only company that can go in now in 2025 and get a royalty on these top mines. So when you talk about creating a multi-billion-dollar business that's stable, safe, and will provide long-term shareholder value, I believe we're a great option.
And Kody, any thought of involving Indigenous groups from outside of Canada who might have royalty streams of their own on some great mines around the world?
Yeah, 100%. One thing about the Canadian Indigenous landscape is it's much further ahead and more developed than a lot of the other places on the globe. The relationship between the Crown and Indigenous people in Canada from the Royal Proclamation, I don't need to give a history lesson to listeners, but since kind of its colonization has gone a lot farther than, let's say, the US or Australia or Chile, Argentina, all these other places. So the agreements are much better. That $350 million that I had mentioned, I can't find anything that compares to that internationally. I'm definitely talking with groups in Australia, some in the US. There's some really big oil royalties. I know the groups in Alaska are very developed, and some others. So mainly focused in Canada. We have a lot of wood to chop, as mentioned, 350 million in the metals and mining space, and then, over 700 million with oil and gas. Like, just to collect that in itself is a tremendous feat. But definitely looking international. Talking, like I said, talking with some groups in Australia. There's a few royalties coming up there, but it's not commonplace for industry to actually pay Indigenous groups royalties. They're used to only paying government royalties. And that's kind of like the mindset down there. I've chatted with a few different folks. And in the States, they don't have the kind of unceded territory, jurisdictional, legal landscape that we have in Canada, right? So, Canada is our primary focus, but you are starting to see better agreements go over the border into the US and Australia. So, we're doing our best to advocate for Indigenous people and getting better financial payments and agreements. And hopefully we start to see more impact benefit agreements, financial payments going internationally in the coming years.
Yeah, it's one of the latest great Canadian exports, I think, is what is happening in some of the structures being used in the Indigenous economy in Canada. We, as a law firm, are getting calls from other groups in other parts of the world, saying, including the States, Central America, saying we're noticing what Canadian Indigenous groups are doing, and we'd like to understand how they're structuring some of these arrangements.
Yeah, 100%. So one example that I have that actually just hit home recently, I was at Beaver Creek Precious Metals Summit in Beaver Creek, Colorado. And I was chatting with George Salamis with Integra Resources. So they have some projects in the States. And the Tahltan Nation actually has some very developed agreements, whether it's government to government or industry to Tahltan. And George had brought up 3 tribes, they call them in the States, to Tahltan territory to actually learn about our impact benefit agreements and to adopt those on their project. So shout out to Integra for doing fantastic work, but that's just one example of groups kind of looking towards Canada and the agreements that we have set to help progress their projects in their jurisdictions as well, because it's a huge de-risking process. It's a partnership, right? Creating a good agreement from the get-go is a huge de-risking piece for the life of the project. And if you can create good agreements from the beginning, you can create alignment, and you can de-risk returns for shareholders and all your stakeholders and rights holders alike.
You mentioned Frank Giustra. He's a legendary investor, well known in London, mining and investing circles, Canadian. How involved is he in the business?
Yeah, Frank has been amazing for helping us get this company off the ground, getting publicity for it, and just being a fan of it, right? When Rob McLeod and Nisga'a initially brought this idea to him, he said that this is going to be as impactful as streaming was, and as the advent of streaming was in 2004, which is what Wheaton Precious Metals was built on. It's the largest royalty stream company in the world, right? So he saw the tremendous amount of value that could be created by pooling these royalties, these Indigenous royalties. And he's helped us do different marketing pieces. He's a cornerstone on our corporate presentation for anyone that looks at that. Obviously, he speaks about it. He's helped us with our financing. He's helped guide and mentor us, and me personally as well, and really helped us grow this company. He knows what steps to take to create a top royalty company, as one of the co-founders of Wheaton, right? And he's one of our major shareholders outside of Nisga'a. So he is our largest shareholder outside of the Nisga'a Nation, who owns 77%. And once again, huge advocate And we're blessed to be in his office to help grow this thing, because once again, he was there for Wheaton to grow into a $40 billion market cap royalty company. And we look to do the same. And with his guidance, some of the rest of the members of the team that we have, we believe we can achieve that goal.
So I think you're the first and largest owned Indigenous public company in Canada, if not across the world now. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, of course. So we're 77% owned by the Nisga'a First Nation, which I explained earlier, but it's a First Nation group in Northwest British Columbia. And there's never been a public company like this. So on your average day, we've been trading around $80 to $90 million. And once again, Nisga'a owns 77% of this. So it's a really big step forward for Indigenous inclusion into the public capital markets. Right? Indigenous groups have been using private equity and debt and other financial means, but this is the first majority Indigenous owned public company, which is fantastic. And if anybody wants to invest in a company where your dollars go directly into Indigenous people, this is the only company on the market, right? Because generally you're investing in the mining spaces, many spaces that they use their money to invest in community benefits and culture and all these infrastructure and all these things. If you put, I'm just going to make a number up. Say you put $1 million into our company, or many investors do, and our share price went up 20%. Nisga'a Nation's net worth just went up 20% in this equity, right? And our first goal is shareholder return. Our second goal is capacity building. So I'm a Tahltan First Nation member. The majority of our management team is Indigenous. We look to keep it that way. We're actually searching for an Indigenous CEO. The majority of our board is Indigenous. And we look to build Indigenous capacity into the public markets, right? We're learning from Frank Justa. We're working from Gord Keep. Rob McLeod, our CEO, has been in the markets for years. We're helping to build the next generation of Indigenous leaders that are going to be going into the public markets and scaling public companies that are Indigenous owned. So we think it's really cool. We're the first, and we certainly hope we're not the last, right? We see it as a business strategy and a tactic to help grow a top royalty company, but we're also being a shining example of what can be done when you can access risk capital in the public markets and capital that you can't get when you're looking to pull down debt or private equity, right? It gives you that seed capital, build projects that have a little bit of a higher risk portfolio or profile from the get-go. And generally that's what is sitting on Indigenous land if it's a natural resource project. So we're hoping we're the first. We hope we're not the last. We're using it as a first mover advantage to grow a top royalty company. And it's a really big part of what we do here at Nations Royalty.
Yes, that is exciting. And certainly the power of the network, as you're talking about, Indigenous management growing forward. And as the company grows, those people will move off and you start to develop that network. I think the other just interesting things, we like to speak to different Indigenous leaders. You have some items in your office there, besides the beautiful sun that is, of course, not appearing behind Rob as the sun is set, and it didn't even arrive today in London. The sun is shining behind you, but you have some Indigenous art. I see in your office there. Is there a special story on that?
So I'm happy you asked. Thank you, Mark. This one right here is very special to me. There's a famous Tahltan artist named Dempsey Bob. Recently passed. He's a fantastic person. Made a tremendous amount of art. I was at the Odd Dane Museum in Whistler last year or the year before, and his art was on display in the whole gallery. Right, he had an exhibit that covered the whole gallery. Very famous artist. My mom had this piece of art in a storage container for like 30 or 40 years.
Wow.
Or maybe even longer. It was just sitting in a suitcase. And it's an original Dempsey Bob before he became famous.
Wow.
Which I thought was very, very cool. I don't know what it's worth or its value, but my mom had it for this tremendous amount of time. And how he kind of developed his artistic skills is when he first started out, he used a lot of paint, right? Because it could cover up some of the impurities and different pieces like that. So you can see like there's a lot of red and black on it. And as he developed, he used less and less color when his most his kind of newest pieces were where there was no paint. It was all just carved in. They're absolutely beautiful. So you can tell that it's an older piece. And this one's very special to me. So thank you for asking. That one hits home for myself.
You're welcome. And we've just given it a global audience. So now everybody knows about this piece of art you now have.
Perfect.
Kody Penner of Nations Royalty, thanks again for your time, and best of luck with this new old model enterprise. It's a great example of the way Indigenous finance is evolving.
Amazing. Thank you guys for having me.
Best of luck.
Pleasure to have you on. Thank you to Kody Penner for sharing his insights with us. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to subscribe and leave a review by following our YouTube channel at Drumbeats Podcast. Don't forget also to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms shown in the description below, and visit our website for more resources and upcoming discussion. Mark your calendars for the upcoming 2025 Summit taking place on the 10th of April. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.